We never think anything of it. Here's Pizza Hut. Look at the symbolism. The ziggurat, the pyramid, and the sun, and the pentagram. Access Hollywood, pentagram, and the pyramid without the capstone. We looked at, was it Cartoon Network? Now you have Nickelodeon. It's one of the largest channels in American television for children, using all that occult symbolism. In fact, the children's world, as I said, is just absolute. We could do a whole thing on that. Here's Zelda, using the pyramid. Get them when they're young, you see, that's the whole concept. The Sacred Heart. Cartoons and all sorts of programs for the young is infested with this. Get them in the pre-rational state. There's the Eye of Horus, 3 pyramids, triangles. That's called the unicursal hexagram, I believe, which is not evil or anything like that. It's an occult symbol. They're drawing on a reservoir of occult symbolism, and we need to learn how to do that, just to realize it doesn't belong to an individual or a group of individuals. But they get you young. I noticed this when I was a child. On the bubble gum, they attract kids by saying, join our magic circle club. It can be literally as innocuous as that. The seduction can be in the most simplistic ways that you'd never ever, really think about. It could be right in front of you. But how are they seducing the child mind to get into occultism? This is always interesting. This is one example. The symbolism is used a lot, though, of the Black Pyramid and the sun, and then the Serpentine River. As a matter of fact, Tony Bushby, the author, actually suggested there was a Black Pyramid on the plateau of Giza. It was later taken down, and he writes about the Black Pyramid that was there. And we find that pyramid on the Nazi regalia as well. Sometimes it's a combination. The checks, the solar rays, you see the butterflies, it can be a combination. The black and the white girl, which is the syzygy, straight out of Celtic Irish mythology, going back thousands and thousands of years ago. You find it in all the Celtic countries, the dark twin and the light twin and their conflict. That's purely mythological. And if you actually knew about the myths that are involved, it ties into music, it ties into the symbolism of pretty much like you see in things like Snow White, of the evil grandmother, and there's so many ties in, and our subconscious mind sees that. It understands what the symbolism is there, pertaining even to the different aspects of the mind. But of course, we often don't notice that something's up, or at least the masses don't, until there's some sort of breakdown. And that breakdown can be in a multiplicity of ways. A slow decline through alcoholism and just being shunted aside, while the new generation of models comes up and you feel eclipsed, and then the person's faith in the system breaks down. They start becoming sort of demented and breaking the silence. Or it can be a much more sudden and bizarre breakdown. But until it becomes a scandal, most of our attention is never really attracted to the underpinnings of any of this until it becomes a scandal, and then that sort of part of our mind gets interested in it. One of the most important parts of this, though, is the breakdown of the disassociation, the fragmentation, and the split character. And that's even picked up in the ad copy. Never forgetting that the mind control is in itself a kind of a temporary thing, and also never forgetting that these champions, the ones that are used, are expendable. That's why. None of them have any shelf life. And the first moment that something goes awry, they'll be deleted from concern or compromised, so that people think, oh, they're kooks, and then some other person comes, like Paul Simon said, another hero up the pop charts, But again, the ad copy alone is telling you something about the split, schizoid nature of what's going on. This is coming in more and more, even in the videos that are used. We'll finish off by pulling back from the canvas again to remind ourselves how this all comes into being. Why is this cult using this power? I mean, we can't sit here and go into a huge story about the cognitive mind and the subconscious mind and whether or not even subliminal persuasion works or not. I have to keep it strictly about the fact that I don't want you to assume it, but I want you to research it, but to take on board the power that this kind of persuasion has. But also that power works two ways. They're using it on us, but we can return it. We can take the power back, because the moment that you are aware of what these people are doing, they only have a certain limited weaponry, by the way. It's very powerful, as you can see. And it is also ubiquitous. But the thing is that once you become aware of it, just your simple awareness, they've lost their power. That's it. It doesn't work on the person who knows what it is. Not in a contemptuous way, well, I think it's rubbish, so I don't listen to it. No, your mind is wide open. You have to have an empowered understanding of what they're doing and why they're doing it and how they're doing it. Know thine enemy, says the Bible, right? Very true. And know the weapons that the enemy is also using. But the moment that you do, you gain the psychic immunity that stops their power. That's it. It's psychological warfare. You can't raise up arms against these people. They're ready for you. It's too crazy. They know how that game works. But this is the way that you understand it. Once you've cracked the secret, you see, then you have the sword that cuts the Gordian knot of all the other complications. The point was made about symbolism by the Scottish historian Thomas Carlyle, who said that by symbols is man guided and commanded, made happy, made wretched. He everywhere finds himself surrounded with symbols, recognized as such or not recognized. And that is the loophole that this particular cult of sorcerers have used. I mean, it sounds bizarre, but there you have it. Who are these people? Well, they are ideologically, I would even go so far as to say biologically, but certainly ideologically connected, by the way, to ancient sorcerers of the ancient world, particularly a group known as the Medes, or at least the people who have plagiarized the knowledge of the Medes in the same way that the knowledge of the Druids and the Omanists was also plagiarized. But there's actually, the word Media comes from a group of people known as the Media, or the Medes, a very, very ancient group that was ensconced up in a place called Medea. Words like Medic and Medici comes from these terms. It's a place not far from Parthia or Persia. And these were the astrologers, the wise ones, the geomancers, the healers, the apothecaries that the kings of the world called on when you wanted to deal with your enemies, when you wanted to put the spell on them. The word Medea is found in mythology as a female. She was actually related physically to Circe in mythology, and she herself was a murderess and a hypnotist that hypnotized people with drugs. Go and study Medea, M-E-D-E-A, the goddess who hypnotized people using drugs to put them into complete delirium. She's actually related to Circe, another goddess known to turn men into pigs. Right? And now there was actually 6 tribes within. I have an article, this one, that you can look at, History of the Medes. It's just a compilation of information that I found on the Medes. There were 6 tribes of the Medes, and the most powerful of the tribes was called Magi. That's where the word comes from magician. It's actually the name of a tribe within the Median peoples, where the word magus comes from. And the word actually meant rich, powerful, high, intelligent, and it really represented men who are like the highest ones, the high men of the world, the ones overlooking, the ones who've got the great knowledge, the great teachers. And if you read this little article I put up there, I go into those 6 and give the names. They're Aryan. There's a lot of Arya tie-in there. Another fascinating subject. The Medes. Their knowledge is what is behind the Holy Wood, which is very similar to Holy Rood, a place in Scotland run by the Templars. And I believe it's not that these Medes are still alive, but these great groups, whether they're Mithraic, Amonist, Druidic, Chaldean, whoever, Chaldean, their knowledge is what is being misused now. You see what I'm saying? Masonry, these organizations are corrupt because they're using sacred knowledge that was for the uplift of all people for a specific elite, for a specific purpose. The knowledge doesn't belong to them, but they're misusing it. This kind of knowledge knows things that we're not supposed to know. They took this route to use subversive symbolism to manipulate us because they understand the workings of the brain. They understand that there's 37 sensory inputs to the brain, not 5. Well, what's happening with those other senses? Well, didn't we hear R.D. Laing last time? Any so-called abnormal function or behavior or experience is now going to be considered a mark of insanity or dementia. Everything's going to be homogenized. So is our consensus reality. Don't anthropologists know that a habitat of an animal right outside its purview, that animals can be trained, their habitat can be changed on the periphery of their vision, that they haven't the faintest idea what's going on? But slowly the behavior of that animal will be changed because its habitat has been changed. Not all training, you see, is direct. Not all puppets are on strings. And they understand the esoteric, and that's what you find. The use of the wand, the use of the lantern, the use of the sword, the use of these remarkable symbols that you find all throughout the royal families and their connection to the human being is a remarkable study. The whole of Egypt, as the great Swallow de Lubitsch pointed out, was designed to emulate and to simulate the subtle energy of the body, which again it ties into music and all sorts of other phenomena. Then we have the same gang, as they start to misuse this symbolism. Oh, we can't have it for everybody. Wow, this really has a lot of power. Shit, what are we going to do? So then you have the prohibition in the Bible against graven images that comes before the prohibition against murder, right? The prohibition against graven images is before the prohibition against killing people. Can you imagine how important this was to them? Exodus 20, thou shalt not make for yourself a graven image. And Leonard Slane points this out in his book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess. The second commandment forbids Israelites from conveying any iconic information. No illustrations, no colorful drawings, and no art. So far as we know, there has never before existed a culture that forbade representative art. Why should a prohibition against making images be the second most important rule for righteous living? According to the Ten Commandments, art, therefore, is more dangerous than murder. I hope you've been pointing out why. It's because they wanted the arsenal for themselves. Take it out of the hands of humanity. Take it out of the shaman. Take it out of the true keepers of truth. And hoard it for yourself because you've got an agenda. Jerry Mander says the same thing. The Hebrews, emerging between 3000 and 2000 BC, won an important political victory by denouncing what they called the worship of graven images. By destroying the power of the sculptures of the Sumerians and others who preceded them, they effectively destroyed nature-based religion and the veracity of images. Biologically, it means, and psychologically, they close off a whole part of your brain. They want to put a wall between the left and the right brain, is basically what happened, between the masculine and the feminine capacities. That's how you control, isn't it? Divide and conquer, right? In this sign you will conquer. This made possible, he says, the substitution of an abstract, single, male, human, all-powerful God, because it was a sin to create any sculpture of it. It maintained its abstract nature. And so much can be said of this. It's like cutting off your hands. They're cutting off one part of your brain because they're going to control what's left by using this powerful symbolism that is archival. It's absolutely in your race memory, going back to the connection that you have directly with nature, to the stars. Everything in religion, I don't give a damn if it's Protestant or Catholic, comes from astrotheology, the history and the study of the stars. And that is in the deepest reservoir of your unconscious. And while you're tapped into that gnosis, you can't be controlled. So they have to put those barriers up. They have to put those electrical fences up so that they block and canalize that imagination body. It's going to be very important, because when we look at solutions in a minute, this is the way forward once you've understood it. But first of all, if poison has been pouring into your home, you can't start the cleaning up process until you shut the door on the sewer, isn't it? So this is what we're doing. You're going to do the cleanup through your life. But you first have to make sure that the poison doesn't keep pouring in. So the immunity that you get from understanding what these characters are up to immediately shuts down the process. You're completely onto it critically. That closes the door, and then the cleanup is even easier. There really are no other remedies. The great philosopher from Germany, Leibniz, it is a great source of error to believe that there is no perception in the soul besides those of which it is conscious. He's before Freud, talking 1700s here, 18th century, already understood. Pascal even had spoken of the same things. Schopenhauer about how the brain is just besieged with all of this stimuli. The opponents, as we said, they know what we're never supposed to know. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, he said, this is the secret of propaganda. Those who are to be persuaded by it should be completely immersed in the ideas of the propaganda without ever noticing that they are immersed in it. Remember the comments of Edward Bernays, the modern mind controllers and persuaders? I'll leave you with this for this section by Alvin Boyd Kuhn. This incredible statement by Alvin Boyd Kuhn. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, by the way, was the prodigy of Gerald Massey, the great Scottish Egyptologist. And Alvin Boyd Kuhn says, hypnotism need not be induced by overt manipulation or by an operative. One can hypnotize oneself, and the agency can be a suggestion, a philosophy, a persuasion, a conviction, a belief, an infatuation, a book, a sermon, a piece of music, a personality, an addiction of any kind. Hold a conviction long enough, and it ends by holding you. Now we know it as obsession and what have you. If you really take this to the full extent of what he's saying, thinking itself is a primal addiction. We spoke before about Heidegger not even using the word consciousness to describe the thought of most people. And the idea is that over time, and I believe that's what we're seeing right now, is that because of this pestilence, and this is one of the things in the armory of the sorcerers, they knew that by purveying this for years and years and years, this slow drip feed method, that in the end, man would auto-hypnotize himself. Demons may lead you to the brink of the precipice, but they actually can't make you jump. You do that yourself out of fear, and then they have the last laugh. If you're out of your power, you're the victim of anything. A small breeze can topple an oak tree, if that oak tree is not properly, rooted. Because in the in the personality of human beings, it's a simple axiomatic fact of psychology that your psyche, in order to grow high, right, like a great tree, you must at the same time be sinking your roots deeply into the earth. And that means into yourself, into your own soil, into the soil of truth and reality. Otherwise you may grow very high and then it's, what? Catastrophe. And when you fall, you don't just destroy yourself, you take half the forest with you. Anyway, what we'll do now is move to solutions to conclude with. So that we can get even a greater handle on this. So that, looking at the problem is balanced also by resolving it. We'll cover I'll introduce you to a couple of interesting sources and books in a minute. Again, people can always stay tuned to the 2012 webcast we did, The Future of Mankind, which connects with what we're going to be talking about right now. My Outsider series. 3 interviews also pertains to this, and those are all on my new account, Unslaved Films, on YouTube. Again, I emphasize that's the only legitimate account. Unslaved Media and Unslaved Films and Unslaved.com. One of the important books I'd like to bring to your attention and the work of a man is Theodore Roszak, The Voice of the Earth. He also wrote a fantastic book called Where the Wasteland Ends. 2 very important books, C.J. Jung, Carl Jung's works on nature. A book called The Earth Has a Soul, and a monumentally important book by the great psychologist Bruno Bettelheim, personal friend of Sigmund Freud, about the mistranslation of Freud's work and books, right down to the titles. So when people talk about knowing Freudianism, there's a whole conspiracy against Freud run by the American Psychiatric Association to basically de-spiritualize his work. And this is a very important book that addresses this, about how even the terminology, when he talked about the conscious and unconscious minds, his words in German were loaded with spiritual meaning and really deep existential meanings, and those were purposely mistranslated to make him appear to be a materialist reductionist. You see, a conspiracy against his work. And a very heavy-hitting psychologist. Beautifully written and very valuable book. From a more of a scientific bent, or let's say alternative bent, a book I refer to a lot of my work is Richard Milton, The Shattering Myths of Darwin. Again, a heavy hitter. He was the scientific correspondent for the Observer magazine. who deals with the whole evolution lie. On my Irish Origins appendix pages, there's also a little page there on the lie of evolution. Two important books again on alternative science: The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot, which goes deeply into the work of David Bohm and Carl Pribram on the connections between the mind and nature, consciousness and the world, subatomic science, quantum science, what is known as the implicate order, as opposed to the explicate order. A very reader-friendly book, an absolute masterpiece. For those who are even more into the science, The Big Bang Never Happened by Eric J. Lerner. That is a wonderful book that goes into the works of Hans Alfvén, the Swedish scientist, and his plasma cosmology that refutes the Einsteinian paradigm. A little more heavy reading though. Leonard Schleyn's Art and Physics and The Alphabet versus the Goddess, I think, are essential reading. More from what we'll be talking about today, the existentialist paradigms that we'll be discussing. If people are really unfamiliar with this existentialistic angle that I deal with a lot in my work, such as Disciples of the Mysterium, Colin Wilson's The Outsider is a very good introduction. And if you're more into fiction, then of course Hermann Hesse, the great author, will introduce you to that paradigm, the existentialistic paradigm. And I guess if you're into poetry, then of course we can mention many names, the top of which is Rainer Maria Rilke. Alan Watts's The Book, we'll be referring to that a lot in this presentation. The full title is The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. And the very important book that I refer to a lot, Eric Fromm's The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. Again, phenomenally important works of Arno Gruen, The Betrayal of the Self, The Insanity of Normality. Very much akin to R.D. Laing, because these are, along with Thomas Szasz, these are the people who are the anti-psychiatric psychologists. It's very important to read these kinds of works, because once you know who the greats are, well, then you can easily spot the faux version. There's so many voices in the world. Read the masters. When you've digested the meaning and the depth of what they say, hey, the job of finding out who's the Judas or just half-baked truth becomes very obvious. Read the masters, because then you save the world from your ignorance. You know, there's a statement, isn't there? The man who does not like to read is the equal of one who cannot read. And then, as we showed in the trailer, highly recommended works of the psychologist Thomas Szasz, The Myth of Mental Illness. I emphasize these people because I believe it's monumentally important when it comes to solutions. And what I'm going to say now, you should listen to like you've never listened to anything else in your life. Because it's very, very important for the people you know, for yourself, and for the people that you're going to meet every day, especially in the coming years. Because everybody's talking about breakdown, everybody's talking about losing the thread, everybody's talking about their depressions. What happens if those depressions, if those feelings of futility, anxiety, whatever, are the closest you or that person have ever been to true selfhood? But that part of the mind, conditioned by all this pestilence that we've been talking about, is making you think that it's not. What happens if your depression is your best friend and your greatest teacher? And we went into this in the 2012 talk in Los Angeles. Mentioned it in brief. What happens if your tragedy, your pain, your anxiety, your angst is the closest you have ever come, or that person who's giving you those problems, that laundry list of how they can't handle it, can't keep the job, can't keep the marriage, as if that's all normal? They can't find the harmony and the normality in an abnormal, deeply sick world? Do you know that the door to reality, the gate, is incredibly narrow? I don't want to become biblical with you here. I don't want to preach a sermon, but the way out of this maze is extremely narrow. It's very hard. We're talking very serious stuff here. And we have to turn around, right, and re-examine a lot of what we've been told, even by a lot of the psychologists and the doctors and the so-called experts. What happens if those dark voices that you think are so alien and so foreign and so ghastly are actually there because this is the first time in your life that you've actually even approached the shrine of your own selfhood, your own aloneness, your own stillness. But the chorus of all that other stuff and all the chorus of the experts has you completely thinking the opposite. And so it's big pharma now, and it's drugs, and it's futility, and it's even suicide. Or it's immersion in all the other falseness of the world, thinking that you're now returned to sanity. Now Heidegger already said this about our consciousness, the inauthentic and the authentic man. Because the pain and the so-called tragedy that comes with authenticity has its own beauty. It's in the running away from all of these aspects of yourself that's when the problems arise. In talks of people like myself, we're forever pointing out that there's an external adversary. We just spent 2 hours doing it. But the negotiation of that external adversary and all of its elements and all of its arsenal is really only 50% of the extraction process. It's a very valuable aspect. But as a matter of fact, there are 2 demons that stand between you and the road of selfhood or the road of truth. 2 demons, and one is the internal adversary. So those who leave that aspect out, leave out the psychology, are only helping you somewhat, because you have the external adversary to fend off and become aware of and study and disempower, but you also have this thing inside yourself, the mind, the ego, the conditioning. You see, all the vices that they put there. The anti-psychologists are basically telling you, look, you think that if you live in this world, being a self is almost considered a disease. Well, as a matter of fact, it is. The search for your own selfhood has become the ultimate disease. So everything else that leads you away from selfhood is being endorsed by the world. And so now the world is screaming for down with Big Brother, you know, and Illuminati must be destroyed. Because we understand that the people who are working behind the world, who control the world, are sick. They're demented, they're psychopathic. And in fact, as I've said before, they are the beings that are holding civilization back. But just as on a social level, right, these destroyers, these sorcerers, they hold society, they hold culture, they hold civilization back. How can you fight them when their poison is in your head and your thought processes is holding you back? You see how it works on the microcosmic and the macrocosmic level? If your thinking has identified with the master, then your own development and progress is stunted and arrested. Isn't it almost a paradox to believe that you can run out then in the social world and bring down this other higher pestilence? It's a reciprocal relationship between your own mind and your own thought patterns and your own strength or lack of it and what is going on in the social domain. But before we can get deeply into the solutions, we've got to start at the beginning. You begin at the beginning again. Trauma, ancient trauma. Everything you see today, everything that's made by mind, everything that's made by thought is a manifestation of ancient trauma, which we've gone into at great length in other works. Paul Shepard, an activist and commenter on this problem, in his book A Kind of Madness, says the change to a more hostile stance towards nature began between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, and became more destructive and less accountable with the progress of civilization. In hindsight, this change has been explained in terms of necessity or as the decline of ancient gods. But more likely it was an irrational, though not unlogical, and unconscious, a kind of failure in some fundamental dimension of human existence. An irrationality beyond mistakenness, a kind of madness. So here we are, we're conscious. We talked last time about the weight of that and the bittersweetness of it, the fact that man has consciousness that maybe other forms of life don't have. Theodosius Dobzhansky, the geneticist, says that self-awareness and foresight brought the awesome gifts of freedom and responsibility. Man feels free to execute some of his plans and to leave others in abeyance. He feels the joy of being the master of the world and of himself. But the joy is tempered by the feeling of responsibility. Man knows that he is accountable for his acts. he has acquired the knowledge of good and evil. This is a dreadfully heavy load to carry. No other animal has to withstand anything like it. There is a tragic discord in the soul of man. So in various ways, these experts, as you have noticed this conflict, this direction in the human psyche. Partly to do with this fact that we can think about meaning, we can think about life, we can think about thought. And we can also hold our actions, we can feel responsible for our actions, which brings out guilt and shame and accountability and all sorts of things. We can also think about the future. We have temporal consciousness. We saw these quotes before by Jung. He said that consciousness is a very recent acquisition of nature, and that is still in an experimental state. It is frail, menaced by specific dangers, and easily injured. As anthropologists have noted, one of the most common mental derangements that occur among primitive people is what they call the loss of a soul. And he goes on to say that I'm not denying that great gains have resulted from the evolution of civilized society, but these gains have been made at the price of enormous losses, whose extent we have scarcely begun to estimate. Now I would stop there, you see, and the rest of this presentation is basically a question of losses? What losses? Let's get into that. What do you mean when you say that the gains of what we have something over here that's really good, but you say that it's been gained at the price of enormous losses? I'd like to know what those are. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe the investigation of that will lead us to the heart of the problem. The kind of consciousness we have, as I said, that type of interiority, right, that subjectivity that came with the trauma, because as Julian Jaynes and others have shown, you didn't have a consciousness of yourself, you didn't have a feeling of what you might call selfhood, you didn't have that feeling, I am a separate identity, all through the centuries. That is a recent concept. And of course the animals of the world, they don't have quite that same type of consciousness. But at the same time, they are directly piped into what is real. Nature and their minds are plugged in, because they're not sitting there worrying about their death and worrying about their actions and all the other stuff that we humans are involved with. Right? Scientists have tried to reduce it and go, well, they just have instinct, without even really telling you what that is or where it comes from. No, instinct is the fact that they are governed by the ordinances of nature, which they also obey. We have lost touch of that. We don't obey it, they do. The great teacher Alan Watts said that nothing so eludes conscious inspection as consciousness itself. This is why the root of consciousness has been called, paradoxically, the unconscious. Now that's very interesting. It pertains to the divisions that exist within consciousness. We don't even, in our definition of consciousness, we have to admit that it's divided or subdivided. Right brain, left brain, right? Mammalian, limbic, frontal, etc. Or conscious, unconscious. That's very interesting. Is that part of the trauma? Because we saw with the mind control concepts, yes it is. Splitting the mind also involves multiple personalities, dividing in order to be able to control. So have we done that? Are we victims in that same sense? Where the house is like a mansion with many rooms, some with the light on and some without? And also, by having that kind of split and that kind of division, those ego defenses that all psychologists know about, what does that do to thought? What does that do? Or if we are divided within, right, where you actually now are feeling that one part of you, you're disassociated from it, it's not part of you, it's not integrated into consciousness, then we have to find the internal adversary. And we know that it is. And it doesn't matter whether you buy into Freud's 3-part schemata, or Jung's 4-part schemata. It's simple. We know that there's a conscious and unconscious self. Many divisions. We have the persona. We even call people persons. Right? Here's a person. The word just means a facade. Even the very word refers to just a facade. And as I said, if you have disharmony within these modes of being, right, within the anatomy of your own psyche, some people have more, some people have less. If you have these kinds of divisions and this kind of disharmony, you're not only a weaker individual, you are now dependent on all the gimmickry that's going to come in and tell you how to gain it. So instantly you've lost your center. And then one thing leads to yet another and another and another, as you try to get out of the mix, out of the problem. As we said, the door to truth is narrower than you think. We are entrapped in a maze, in a web, And the strange thing about that web is that the more that you try to escape from it, the tighter it becomes. We're strangling ourselves often by our very attempts to be free. Who do you think loves that? Who do you think earns dividends because of our efforts, even spiritually, to liberate ourselves? Who earns points from that? Who is established from that? Do you see what I'm trying to say? That the bottom of the pyramid supports the top in the internal conflicts and the inability to resolve it in true ways, holistic ways, and by all the fakery and the gimmickry and the running into all the false things. The most evil psychopaths sunning themselves because of it. It's reciprocal. Never forget that. Then the psychologists who say, well, okay, then we'll just deal with opening those inner reservoirs for you. We'll show you the right way. What happens? The inner adversary thinks differently. Freud found that if the analyst touched upon repressed material, the patient would resist his therapeutic approach. This is not a matter of conscious unwillingness on the part of the patient, or of dishonesty, or of secretiveness. He is defending himself against the discovery of the unconscious material without being aware either of the material or of his resistance. The patient can turn away from the sensitive topic and talk about something else. It's like Heidegger's chit-chat. He can feel sleepy and tired. He can find a reason not to come to the interview, or he can become very angry against the analyst and find some reason to quit the analysis. Ever tried playing shadow to people? It's the resistance, if you take what I said last time. By resisting going into the unconscious. Remember Jung's quote about the shadow? And I said that another translation was that by not doing the shadow work, it's really basically that you're, like he said, doing anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid dealing with your soul. That's what this is all about. That resistance is not just a reflex to stop you going into the unconscious. It's the reflex that prevents you from growing and making your own soul, if you take my theory that that's what we're here to do. It's so important that this resistance and what it's about. Because if you're thinking you came in with the soul and the soul is there, then of course this is meaningless. This is absolutely meaningless. But the moment that you realize that your life and your experience is here to develop the thing called your soul that you don't have when you come in. You have nature's spark of life, that's animate, that's different. But the soul, your individual purpose, your dharma, you don't have, and you're meant to build that here. And that's what this is really talking about. That we resist doing that. Then we have to look into that, why that would be. Now, the present era, the age of revealing, the age of awakening. Well, the trauma, I say, occurred in relatively recent times. The plagues we experience are relatively new. We are in the beginning stages of understanding and recovery. This healing has negative consequences for the architects of control and for all forms of totalitarianism, as we've already stated. We are young. This trauma happened recently, so we're still in the early stages. We have to be very forgiving and very compassionate with ourselves and realize that we're making great progress, and greater progress will be done. And as this healing and recovery takes place, that is the main death knell for the Black Lodge, for the Sorcerers. Nothing else. You can run around with your political placards as much as you like. They're not even worried about that. In their own symbolism, we looked at some of it. The very fact that they use the checkered floor, the black and white squares of the checkerboard, the chessboard, is emphasizing the conflict between ignorance and knowledge. That's what the war is all about. Their own symbolism tells you that. The Bible tells you that. The sacred Gospels tell you that. The Gospel of Philip, it says, ignorance is the mother of all evil. In Proverbs, the wise will inherit honor, but the fools get disgrace. Didn't Socrates say that the greatest good is knowledge, the greatest evil ignorance? The Indian words for it are dharma and karma. Dharma meaning the reason you're here. Not the reason your mother wanted you to be born and daddy thinks you're going to carry on his name and the uncle wants you to follow in his business and everything and all this nonsense. Or they're going to hand you over to the monks and the priests to do as they say. Dharma is your reason for being here. Karma is ignorance. That's all the word means. And you're not in dharma when you're in karma. When you are not plugged into your selfhood, then you have the karma. When you have your selfhood, karma stops. It's not sins accumulating through time like the priests have lied to you about. That doesn't make any sense if you logically think it over. It makes a lot of sense to them because they can control your ass. But the point is that karma is your ignorance, your unawareness of the true meaning of life. The moment that you are aware of the purpose that you're here, there is no karma. You step out of karma. That's the way out. In modern parlance, in philosophical parlance, it's simply authentic and inauthentic existence. Now, in many interviews and other works we talked about this, the guilt complex, and how this plugs into all of this. Each one of us has a primal guilt, an unconscious guilt. Not the guilt of doing misdemeanors, and faux pas in this life. That's different. We have a subconscious guilt. Where does it come from? It comes from the commitment to the inauthentic life. It's tied in with karma, but the idea is that the guilt, you have a primal guilt. Psychologists know all about it. But it comes, how do you get it? It comes because you make an unconscious decision to live inauthentically. With that comes a certain guilt. And that guilt then, it's almost like, say, the inauthentic life is the soil. From that grows the tree, the hideous inverted tree of the guilt complex, and from that come all the other negative branches, all the filthy offspring of this one demon. Because now that you're committed to the inauthentic life, now you're going to deny it. Now you're going to justify it, right? Now you're going to decorate it. Now you're going to be in denial and denial of the denial. Now you're going to want this inauthentic existence to be better, brighter, safer, and more secure. Now you're going to say, I want to cluster with other inauthentic souls to make me feel that I've done the right thing. Hence the collectivism that comes about. You see, and there's many more we could mention. Then you have the ubiquitous extroversion, just running around infatuated with all of the domestic and social minutiae. The infatuation with nonsense in the world, and the chronic dependency on others, and then the fact that you don't get the cues and affectations back, which makes you a neurotic individual. Now that you're dependent, then you don't get what you want, you become now completely neurotic. One level of derangement, you see, leading to another. One hideous inverted tree of life, as I've described it. The way out of it, of course, is to return to the dharmic life. And that's what we're going to examine, how to do that. Or I said one of the other negative aspects that comes of this, one of the offspring, is just the ubiquitous competitiveness. Now you have to be better than the other inauthentic soul, where you don't have true stance, you don't have true status, you don't have true sovereignty. So now you run around performing, using your body like some sort of crazy thing to outperform others. It's nothing more than hierarchy. You're building your own hierarchies. And from the top of your pyramid, you're shouting the other pyramid down. Down with the Illuminati while you stand on the top of your own pyramid. Wonderful. They're doing that, aren't they? They can't rise of their own nature. They're the lowest psychopathic people. But you can rise in another way. Suppress everybody else. Artificially suppress everyone else, and that's how you get a feeling of the high. The spiritual man, the true magus, he rises of his own accord. It's not relevant to what anybody else does. The collectivism, right across the street. Posters saying, we are you. Right? I am who I am because of everyone. And people think nothing of this. This makes them fuzzy and warm all over. Because the identity is being sold in the marketplace. Talking again about the unconscious mind and its nature. Freud said nothing can be brought to an end in the unconscious. Nothing is past or forgotten. Right? The sorcerers know this, which is why they use symbolism. Like the Scots historian Carlyle was talking about. They're using that as a weapon against you because they know in here there is no time. In the unconscious, wow, it's a quantum universe in which all reality is there in an implicate way. Carl Gustav Jung puts it this way: when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside of you as fate. So that which you repress, that's what you divide, that which you try to cut off. Nature has a higher plan. Remember we talked about the tragedy that visits you? Yeah, that's the plan. The plan is the unconscious is made of the same thing nature is. So fate will work against your inauthenticity. Thank God it does. I wish it didn't come in the form of pain and tragedy and sorrow. But it does. Therefore, we have to then enter into a new relationship with those dark guardians. Or continue resisting it, which continues the repression, which continues the faith. An endless circle, you see, of problems. And it's really never more true than today, you see. Now we look at man and his world. How his mind does create his reality. Well, Plato said it. States are as men, they grow out of human characters. The great Thomas Paine. To understand the nature and quantity of government proper for man, it is necessary to attend to his character. He goes on to say, the more perfect civilization is, the less occasion it has for government. Because you're self-governed. What do you need leaders for? Benjamin Franklin said it in this way. He said, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. All pointing to the fact that what's in your inner constitution, your inner republic, will manifest externally. Erich Fromm, whose book we looked at earlier, and I want you to note these scholars, note these authors, these sources that we're referring to. He says that in addition to sadism, the passion to destroy life and the attraction to all that is dead, which is called necrophilia, is true meaning of the word, seem to develop in the new urban civilization. Right? Mind affects the world, world affects mind. It becomes a feedback loop. What is above is below, is the old Hermetic adage. He says that death is no longer symbolically expressed by unpleasant smelling feces or corpses. Its symbols are now clean, shining machines. But the reality behind this antiseptic facade becomes increasingly visible. Man, in the name of progress, is transforming the world into a stinking and poisonous place. He pollutes the air, the water, the soil, the animals, and himself. He is doing this to a degree that has made it doubtful whether the earth will still be livable within 100 years from now. As your psyche becomes more toxic, so does your outer world. It'll become axiomatic to us. Freud understood this deeply. Again, the psychologists have to pick up the pieces of all of these souls. So for Freud, the historical process is essentially tragic. The more man creates cultures, the more does he frustrate his instinctual drives. The more unhappy and neurotic does he become. We talked about the trauma. In my work, I've always suggested that out of that trauma was born the ego. What we know today to be waking ego consciousness is the product, a recent product, an infantile, childlike troubleshooting and problem-making, problem-creating circuitry within our consciousness. Of course, the ego is particularly oriented, like a lighthouse light, to the external world. It's not really oriented towards the inner world at all. And we have to thank the ego for also saving us. Probably we would have a complete psychosis given what happened in ancient times. William Barrett, in his book Irrational Man, which is a book on existential philosophy, he says, so long as we remain in the womb of this externalized and public existence, we are spared the terror and the dignity of becoming a self. So again, we've lost ourselves in the light. We're actually hiding, not in the darkness, but in the light. Hiding amongst all the other existentially vagrant souls, screaming about allness and oneness and all of this other talismanic terminology, because it's the last thing we have inside. Won't spend much time on it, but my work, my analysis of all of this, I also say that with the ego, or you can think of it as an aspect of the ego if you will, came this thing I refer to as the mysterium. That the ego is really a two-headed monster. And that this mysterium has worked in the dark. It's one of the reasons why there are the barriers. See, everybody talks about these various levels of consciousness, or the ego and the pre-conscious and the subconscious. They forget about the barriers in the middle. That must be made of something. Where did they come from? I'm interested in finding out where the glue and cement came to create the barriers. What's that made out of? I mean, it's like, you take the meat away and you throw away the other part. Yeah, but wait a minute. Where did that sinew come from? Who made those walls and those fences? Some would say, as they do, it's the ego, another part of the ego, or it's the superego. Wow. Well, I looked into it and I refer to this archetypal or ersatz, or pseudo-archetypal presence as the mysterium. But anyway, moving on, Commenting more on the pseudo-self, or the ego as we say, Jung says, inasmuch as the ego is only the centrum or center of my field of consciousness, it is not identical with the totality of my psyche, being merely a complex among other complexes. Since I discriminate between the ego and the self, since the ego is only the subject of my consciousness, while the self is the subject of my totality, hence it also includes the unconscious psyche. In this sense, the self would be an ideal factor which embraces and includes the ego. So he's just trying to define more clearly what the self is. The ego, right, is only an ego because it's the social persona that divides itself off from the rest of consciousness, the vast majority. The self is the totality, including the ego and the unconscious. And so one could argue, as I do, that when psychologists talk about madness, dementia, psychosis, schizophrenia being the result of the waves and the waters of the dark unconscious, the id coming in to upset, right, the normality of the ego, what happens if they're wrong? What happens if the content of the unconscious doesn't seek to overwhelm and destroy the ego, but to embrace it? But that embrace has been mistranslated. We each fear that embrace. You know why? Because the ego wants to do the embracing. To use religious terminology, maybe the reason why you can't embrace God or embrace the goddess is because you need to be able to be embraced by that force. And as you strive to gain it, have it, want it, that force is pushed away. It's a very yin thing, being loved by the force. You can love it, but it's when it loves you that's the main thing. And how do you become receptacle to that? How do you become feminine enough to receive that wisdom? Well, the ego is incapable of that. It's not programmed for it, so don't expect it to happen. There's only one thing the ego is programmed out of, and that's trauma. So it'll act like a traumatized creature. Now, there's the quote. Carl Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to stop from facing their souls, to stop from doing their shadow work. So when a psychologist tries to get in there, all sorts of resistances and defenses come out. He's talking about soul. Religious people talk about it. It's no different than the self. Self and soul are identical words. And here's the classic quote right here. Thomas Saz. People often say that this or that person has not found himself. But the self is not something one finds. It is something one creates. Once you understand that, you have basically unplugged all the lie mechanisms that exist around you. That is the first step on the road to true self-discovery, true enlightenment. I've often pointed out that the soul, the self, is the soul. It is also specifically identical with what the religious people, the Christians, speak of as the Holy Spirit. And I elaborated on this in the article, 2012, Shiva and the Age of Aquarius and all of that. That's gone into in great depth. Well, you don't want to do it, which most people don't want to do, any of that. They'd rather run around. Okay, well, Ayn Rand reminds you of the consequences for that. Man, as she says, is free to choose not to be conscious. But he's not free to escape the penalty of unconsciousness, destruction. What do we see in the world? That level of denial. The magician Aleister Crowley put it in probably the most succinct language that you could imagine. He said that anyone who is forced from his own course, either through not understanding himself or through external imposition, comes into conflict with the order of the universe and suffers accordingly. Now, this is a man who's been accused of everything you can imagine. Every epithet of horror has been applied to him. No less, he was called a black magician. He says in his own words, I have been accused of being a black magician. No more foolish statement, he says, has ever been made about me. I despise the thing to such an extent that I can hardly believe in the existence of people so debased and as idiotic as to practice it, meaning evil magic or black magic. But he's talking here about the useful or necessary suffering that is visited upon you because you are out of accord with the universe, her, it, nature, which is ultimately the self. Live external to it, expect pain. Live in discord to the world's laws, expect pain. But what kind of pain do you want? The pain of the ever-loving mother or the pain of the boss hogs? It's your choice. Vernon Howard, the American teacher and philosopher, said that human sickness is so severe that few can bear to look at it. But those who do will become well. That's right. The first stage of the awakening process is that to realize you can't live in a one-season world. To do so, to ignore those seasons of the psyche is as mad and as insane as to try to avoid nature's cycles and rhythms, not only of the week, but of the month and of the season. I put it in another way in the 2012 talk. I said, you can voice it this way. You can say, have I been sold a lie? That's one level of where people often can come to, right, when they sort of question that. Or the more adept and ultimately the more wise person phrases the question this way: have I bought a lie? See, one is disempowered, the other is empowered. Because somebody can sell you something doesn't mean you've got to buy it. Now Pythagoras, because this story's been known long time ago. It's not just something of the modern age, you know. Back in the 6th century BC, Pythagoras put it this way: thou shalt know, self-chosen are the woes that fall on men. How wretched, for they see not good so near, nor hearken to its voice. Few only know the pathway of deliverance from ill. So in my work, I'm not that interested or concerned, you see, with all of these different, the social reform where one tyrant replaces another tyrant. We've had that. I think we should be all waking up to that, how unsustainable that is. I'm looking at this reform within, the psychological reform, of how unbelievably violent we are to ourselves. We get distracted with the external violence, and that'll be handled, and it needs to be looked at. But we are infinitely violent with ourselves, infinitely masochistic and self-sadistic. And it's that kind of creature that then breeds it all throughout the world in its other forms and permutations. Sophocles put the entire problem this way. He's a great Greek playwright and deep thinker, and he said that, look, nothing vast enters the life of mortals without a curse. Talking about that suffering again. Somehow, as our tragedy, our pain, our sorrow leads us back to the shrine. I wish it wasn't that way, but it is. Therefore, the only thing to do then is to come into a different relationship with that force of tragedy. And I hope you can explore a little bit about that today. Now, Jung says this: the foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. That kind of sounds weird until you realize that there's a whole tradition of it through the mythologies and the great peoples of the world. Based their entire pantheons and seek and search for enlightenment on that very statement. For instance, Gerald Massey reminds us the Egyptians had no vicarious atonement, no imputed righteousness, no second-hand salvation. No initiate in the Osirian mysteries could possibly have rested his hope on reaching heaven on the Galilean line of glory. His was the more crucial way of Amenta. Amenta meaning the underworld. To tread with the guidance of the word, that step by step and act by act he must himself make true. So what we're talking about was literally the bedrock of all of the theologies of the ancient world before it got corrupted. This process of Amenta, this process of stepping yourself step by step to your own Dharma, has been referred to in psychological language by Jung as individuation, the separation, the differentiation of yourself from every other person around you and the world in general. The opposite, habituation, which everybody knows. Conformity, escape into the domestic minutiae. In alchemy and in magic, this individuation is nothing more than the chemical wedding. But as I said in 2012 talk, that all sounds rosy until you realize that before you can have the chemical wedding, you must experience the chemical divorce. The divorce from everything that is not true. All the fakery, all the lies, all the deceit, right? The external and internal adversaries. You arrive at the wedding, right? After you've gone through the detox process. Ayn Rand, who wasn't necessarily a psychologist, but basically said the same thing in different ways. She said that civilization is the process of setting man free from men. In other words, individuation. Anti-collectivism. There's two words I'd like to introduce to you, and I hope you know. Wilhelm Windelbrand, a psychologist, sociologist, came up with two incredible words. He said ideographic. And these words pertain to what we're talking about. Ideographic, meaningful events or experiences which cannot be replicated or understood with general absolute rules or codes, or the nomothetic ones, experiences which are replicable and scientifically verifiable. The Taoists and Zen say you can't step on the same piece of water twice. That's ideographic. As I said, your memories of your schoolyard, right? Your memories of whatever it might be, the pencil you wrote with at school, you know, your first friends playing with marbles in the street or whatever, it's your memory. It's absolutely ideographic, but we are conditioned out of that. Well, everybody does that. Revisit all the things you've done in your life and realize those are unique to one person, yourself. Nomothetic, well, that's everybody, and can be reproduced mechanically. Alan Watts puts it this way: the most strongly enforced of all known taboos is the taboo against knowing who or what you really are behind the mask of your apparently separate, independent, and isolated ego. In other words, you have the pseudo-self, the ego. But behind that, well, there's a void. The great psychologist Arno Gruen said it this way: a distorted development of autonomy is the root cause of the pathological and ultimately evil element in human beings. Eric Fromm says that self-awareness, reason, and imagination have disrupted the harmony that characterizes animal existence. Their emergence has made man into an anomaly, a freak of the universe. He's part of nature, subject to her physical laws, and unable to change them. Yet he transcends nature. He is set apart while being a part. He is homeless, yet chained to the home he shares with all creatures. The Bible, right? Jesus' words, man, the Son of Man, hath no place to rest his head. We are set apart, we're different. That means we've got a duty. That's why it's very important. We're set apart because we have a dharma to perform. And the parasites, right, the infected ones, the agents of the sleep, the agents of Newtonian sleep, that want to keep us in this unconscious, inauthentic, ignorant, ultimately ignorant mode. It's basically a conflict between them. But they represent a part of our own selves that wants to also remain in that state. They're just external manifestations of it. Cast into this world, says Fromm, at an accidental place and time, he's forced out of it accidentally and against his will. Being aware of himself, he realizes his powerlessness and the limitations of his existence. He's never free from the dichotomy of his existence. He cannot rid himself of his mind, even if he would want to. He cannot rid himself of his body as long as he is alive, and his body makes him want to be alive. So he's looking at both the positive and negative aspects of being conscious. The great R.D. Laing says it this way: true sanity entails in one way or another the dissolution of the normal ego, the false self competently adjusted to our alienated social reality, the emergence of the inner archetypal mediators of divine power, and through the death and rebirth and eventual re-establishment of a new kind of ego functioning, the ego, now being the servant of the divine, is no longer its betrayer. So he's saying again what we talk about chemical wedding, chemical divorce. You have to deconstruct one sense of self before the other arises in its place. Jung says it this way: only when all crutches and props are broken and no cover from the rear offers even the slightest hope of security, does it become possible for us to experience an archetype that up until then has lain hidden. The archetype of meaning. Remember D.H. Lawrence's quote about being sponged out, erased? Remember the alchemical idea about being reduced down to the basic elements? And previously we even analyzed the alternative meaning of the word enlightenment. The lightness, right, in weight that comes when you do this process. When you are no longer emotionally affected, either negatively or positively, by what another person thinks, says, and does. Now, that's not just a statement. I mean, try it. I mean, go and do it. Or find out how impossible it is. Experiment with yourself. How much time and energy does your mind spend? Don't judge yourself, just observe it. How much do other people matter to you? How much thought goes into what X, Y, and Z are doing? Don't judge yourself, don't critique yourself, don't become self-sadistic over it. Just observe it. How much other people matter to us psychologically. And then realize that everyone is doing that. There's a crime going on around the world, you know. And it starts right here. Just observe it and let it draw from it whatever conclusion you want. Some people may think, I want to be like that. That's what it's all about. That's life. That's caring. That's giving. That's self-sacrifice, whatever. I'm just making the statement. Or, more deeply, observe yourself and how your idea of yourself, because I won't condescend to call it your real self, because actually the person who's in true selfhood hasn't got the slightest disaffection by what another person says, thinks, or does towards him. None at all. The reason why you do is because you have an idea of yourself. And the first moment a person says a couple of syllables against that image of yourself, and you become as evil as the George Bushes and the rest of the world, all the tyrants. Their tyranny is just with a bigger gun than ours. You see this in the schoolyards, you see it in the families, you can hear it through the walls of your houses. It's ubiquitous, it's reeking from the world, all of this tyranny. It's not just in the corridors of power. What a luxury to be saying, oh, only there it is. A great deal of this has to do with this intimate connection. It's one of the awarenesses that come on the road. As you climb higher up the mountain, right, you get a bigger vista and revelations that you couldn't have when you're stuck down in the valley. Well, one of them is actually that age-old known thing to shamanism, known thousands of years ago, that's now been hidden, which is the intimate connections between psychic and physical energy, or the microcosm and the macrocosm. Granted, it has been rediscovered by the quantum scientists. The book Holographic Universe is highly recommended for that purpose, for people who want to look back into the scientific aspects of that. Leonard Slane says that according to the new physics, observer and observed are somehow connected, and the inner domain of subjective thought turns out to be intimately conjoined to the external sphere of objective facts. Well, Richard Milton says that Rupert Sheldrake has sought answers to the unexplained mysteries thrown up by research that are usually ignored by science. When a laboratory rat has learned a new trick in one place, other rats elsewhere seem to be able to learn it more easily. When some birds first learned to open milk bottles on the doorstep, birds all over the country suddenly learned the same trick. Sheldrake's solution to these puzzles, proposed in his 1983 book, A New Science of Life, is that organisms and species can learn, develop, and adapt through a process he calls morphic resonance. It's very akin to the implicate order of David Bohm. In the book The Cosmic Serpent by Jerry Narbury, he says that in the early 1980s, thanks to the development of a sophisticated measurement device, a team of scientists demonstrated that the cells of all living beings emit photons at a rate of up to approximately 100 units per second and per square centimeter of surface area. They also showed that the DNA was the source of the photon emission. Photons is the highest form of light that we presently know. Deepak Chopra addresses the whole concept of photonic action and how that's a bridge between the external and internal world, you see. He said photons come out of nowhere. They cannot be stored. They can barely be pinned down in time. They have no home in space whatsoever. See, so they transcend space. They're exactly the same as the unconscious thought processes of our minds work. That is, light occupies no volume and has no mass. The similarity between a thought and a photon is very deep. Both are born in the region beyond space and time, where nature controls all processes in that void, which is full of creative intelligence. Richard Allen Miller and Iona Miller, in their Nexus article, says there is a harmonic relationship between the Earth and our mind-body. Earth's low-frequency isoelectric field, the magnetic field of the Earth, and the electrostatic field that emerges from our bodies are closely interwoven. Our internal rhythms interact with external rhythms, affecting our balance, our REM patterns, and mental focus. So the science is now coming back to what the mystics of old have been saying for years. Now I would ask a question then. Are the mental, emotional, and psychological states of human beings causing the changes in the electromagnetism of the planet? All the dysfunction that we see. And that's drawing very much on the teachings of Wilhelm Reich, who turned all of that upside down and said consciousness is affecting what you imagine his weather patterns, you see, and social changes, and all of that dynamic. And that needs to be taken on board too. As I say, we're not making any point, it's to be studied. Because this could take us into all sorts of areas. Alan Watts says that lack of knowledge about the evolution of the organic from the inorganic, coupled with misleading myths about life coming into this world from somewhere outside, has made it difficult for us to see that the biosphere arises, or goes with, a certain degree of geological and astronomical evolution. As Douglas E. Harding has pointed out, we tend to think of this planet as a life-infested rock, which is as absurd as thinking the body is a cell-infested skeleton. But that's what everybody thinks, isn't it? That's what religion teaches. You just came from out there into this. Not that you grew out of it as a tree grows out of it. That happens to be you out there every time you look at nature. What happens if you thought that? What happens if you realize that's you? That's an extension of your selfhood right there, nature. Nature and you are one. You didn't come out from some mysterious outside of it, into it. You grew from within it, as part of it. It is you and you are it, in the same way that a single drop of water on a leaf reflects the entire topography all around it. What would that do to our thinking if we really caught it, really got in touch with it? That every brother and sister, every tree that you see is part of yourself, by the way. Alan Watts addresses this connection between self and nature. Surely all forms of life, he says, including man, must be understood as symptoms of the earth, the solar system and the galaxy, in which case we cannot escape the conclusion that the galaxy is intelligent. Maybe not the kind of consciousness we have, but it's intelligent nevertheless. Somebody put it there, and it certainly isn't plugged in, although science is desperately seeking to find the plug so we can find out its power, right? He says that the first result of this illusion is that our attitude to the world outside us is largely hostile. We are forever conquering nature, space, mountains, deserts, bacteria, and insects, instead of learning to cooperate with them in a harmonious order. In America, the great symbols of this conquest are the bulldozer and the rocket, the instrument that batters the hills into flat tracks for little boxes made of ticky-tacky, and the great phallic projectile that blasts up into the sky. Well, Mikhail Bakunin, the head of anarchism, put it this way. In his book, God and the State, he says that the liberty of man consists solely in this, that he obeys the laws of nature because he himself recognized them as such, and not because they've been imposed upon him externally by any foreign will whatsoever, human or divine, collective or individual. The champions of selfhood will always put it that way. The great artists know how to tell us subtextually, this story. For instance, this famous image here of Adam, the creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel. Adam is outside the realm of the God. But more so, the creative God is actually sitting inside a brain. Do you see how the cloak that surrounds God there on the right is actually shaped to look like a cross-section of the human brain? God is within, is what Michelangelo is saying. And in a way, that creative force within us, which gave rise to all of this, Adam, as we know ourselves to be, right? He is in fact cut off from that. He is divorced from that. He's separate. He's on the outside until he awakens to the higher truth, which of course you can better believe that the Pope who funded Michelangelo to paint this had no idea what Michelangelo was subtextually saying and referring to. It's actually the most anti-religious statement you could imagine. God is within your brain, you are God. That's not what they wanted to hear. Tony Bushby says that the Church Fathers knew all about this. According to Bishop Epiphanius, the Christ is the spiritual self within each person. Clement of Alexandria, right? Great church patriarch, he says the greatest of all lessons is to know yourself. For when a man knows himself, he knows God. So at one point, even this self-knowledge was featured in religion in a very strong way. In Hebrews we read, without father, without mother, without human descent. His life has neither beginning nor end, but as the Son of God, he abides as a holy priest continually. So the one under God is without any of these connections to other human beings. He stands alone. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, many stand outside the door, But it is only the solitaries who will enter into the bridal chamber, talking about the chemical wedding, that comes after the divorce from all the other falsity of the world. In 1 John we read, "You have been anointed by the Holy One, and have knowledge of all things. The anointing which you received from him abides in you, and you have no need that anyone should teach you, as his chrism teaches you about everything, and is true and is no lie, just as it has taught you, abide in him," the higher self. And once you have that, you need no other authority. As I said, this was in the ancient legends of the earliest peoples on the earth. In the very Song of Odin, it says, "I know that I hung on the windy tree for 9 whole nights." Right? 9 is the cycle of initiation, see? "Wounded with a spear, dedicated to Odin, myself to myself." Nobody stuck him there, nobody nailed him on there. To go and seek the mystery of the runes was a willing participation in suffering, a willing entering into a mentha, right? He hung upside down. And the windy or the winding tree is the Kabbalistic tree on which the secrets of the runes exist, which is nothing more than the self. But the key there is that this was a oblation not to God or not to some guru, but to oneself, not to a cause, not an ideal. Crazy Horse, the shaman of the Lakota people, says that, "I salute the light within your eyes where the whole universe dwells. For when you are at the center within yourself, and I within mine, we shall be as one." Hang on a minute. There's a lot of talk about oneness today. But theirs is the oneness of a million broken shards, unawakened, inauthentic, lost, dependent, codependent, ignorant, broken selves coming together and thinking we're all one. What kind of oneness is that? A paper-mache, Quatermass monster? Allness is that if there has to be a confederation, then let it be of whole men. There's nothing broken about a crazy horse. Those people are not a tribe, they're a tribe within a tribe, right? They are whole people. That is the meaning of wholeness, not this talismanic, globalistic rubbish that you're hearing today. "Come on to me, all ye who are broken and deranged," into our little program. Barrett goes on to say that this seriousness, is the simple and forthright seriousness of someone who has at last arrived at the center, who is therefore at last totally engaged in the project of his life, with all that it entails. This person exists under the eye of eternity, and therefore what he does in the moment is absolutely real. It's nothing more than Heidegger had been saying, Das Ein, being there, being here, you being here. It doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. So don't you see then that this is obvious now what the real holy work is? The holy work is to find out, is it not, what stops you from doing that. Every single thing that prevents you from that level of awareness, from being engaged in the project of your life, must be scrutinized, must be critiqued and understood. You have to understand the anatomy. Forget about finding out what selfhood is. Find out what holds you back from that process. Everything. That's the job. It's not easy. As Friedrich Nietzsche said, the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will often be lonely and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. If you don't own yourself, right? If you don't move from those white squares of knowledge, if you don't move on to the white squares of knowledge, somebody else will. That's the dynamic. It's nothing more complicated than that. If you don't own yourself, somebody else will patent you. They're telling you they're doing it, by the way. They're telling you that's the gig. It makes sense, doesn't it, of all this transhumanism we see. They're owning you. The Russell Trust owns you, the Queen of England, the Pope. If you're not selling yourself elsewhere, they'll own you anyway. They've got rights. Fromm speaks about biophilia, the love of the body, the love of the organic, the love of nature. Biophilia is the passionate love for life and of all that is alive. It is the wish to further growth, whether in a person, a plant, an idea, or a social group. The biophilious person wants to be more rather than to have more. It's connected to what Aristotle talked about, entelechy. The development inherent in every single thing to become something, right? A daffodil doesn't become a potato plant. An oak doesn't become, a myrtle. Everything has the seed of its own identity within it. Everything, even every snowflake is an individual. Now, in one of the earliest scripts, going back thousands upon thousands of years, the Vedas, well, from the Srimad Bhagavatam, this is addressed. Aryans do not kill even a small plant unnecessarily, not to speak of cutting trees for sense gratification. Aryans do not distinguish between lower and higher grades of life. All life should be protected. All living beings have the right to live, even the trees and the plants. This is the basic principle of an Aryan civilization. Compare that to the monstrosities that we are doing today. Mark Twain said, "Once you discover that the whole world is mad, all the mysteries of life stand explained." Well, mad, contradictory. Since the United Nations was founded in 1945, there have been 140 wars. As Nietzsche said, in individuals' insanity, it's rare. But in parties, groups, and epochs, it is the rule. Madame Blavatsky put it this way, talking directly about this biophilia. All the glories of nature, the imposing silence of the night, the aroma of the flowers, the pale rays of the moon, through the green tufts of the trees, the stars, flowers of fire strewn over the sky, the glowworms, all these have been created to render the adept worthy of nature. At that moment when, for the first time, she exclaims to man, "I am yours." Words formed of a divine perfume from the soul, which breathe forth, ascend to heaven together with the perfume of the flowers. The one moment of his life when he is king, when he is God, the moment which he expiates and pays for with a whole life of bitter regrets. That moment, it is the price for all our miseries. Another word for it is negentropia. Nature, as I said, isn't plugged in anywhere. They've never been able to find the socket. How does it all exist without ego consciousness? Well, Spengler says that the reproduction of the species is feminine. It runs steadily and quietly through all species, animal or human, through all short-lived cultures. It is primary, unchanging, everlasting, maternal, plant-like, and cultureless. If we look back, we find that it is synonymous with life itself. And I've spoken often about the fact that this negentropic ability of nature is what is very envied by the lower mind. This is also partly explains what technology is. This self-sustaining negentropic power, of course, remains elusive, it remains unknown, but science, technology is a way of trying to grasp it, appropriate it. William Blake, the poet, in his poem The Sick Rose, explains it by turning the symbolism around. He says that not only is the envy there of man to grasp and own and control that power, see? In other words, in The Sick Rose, he's saying that the dark, poisonous mind blames the beauty of the rose for its own destruction. Right? Which is what psychopathy is. I'm not destroying you. Your beauty brings about your own destruction. There's that necrophilia, that worship of death, the Thanatos instinct. This pertains also to words again. In the Vedic tradition in Sanskrit, the word Maya has often been a word synonymous with illusion or the fall. I mean, this makes a lot of hay in various religions of the East. They're always telling you about escaping Maya and don't be confused by Maya. And even instilling the idea that the physical world, this concrete world, is the Maya, is the illusion. And that is absolutely not what the original word meant. And this is addressed by Alvin Boyd Kuhn, who says, no, the real Maya or illusion is not the natural forms, but it is the mind's propensity to conceive or project forms created by its own inventiveness, but which do not agree with the truth extant or potential in nature. In other words, what he's saying is that your thoughts about nature is the Maya. The projection that you put upon nature, that it is lower, right? Ontologically lower, there's a higher and the lower, that whole hierarchical paradigm, that is the true Maya. It's your own thought about reality. It's your idea about what is, not what is itself. This is another important piece to grasp in the journey, because it pertains even to the idea we have of ourselves. Again, the quantum scientist said it. The great scientist Werner Heisenberg put it this way: what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of understanding. So much so they discovered that even the reality you look at is changed in its complexion by your act of observation. I mean, what could be more magical than that? What could tell you the primacy of consciousness more than that? There's no way out of arguing about that. Nietzsche put it this way: why does man not see things as they are? Because he himself is standing in the way. Our thoughts, our prejudices, stop us from seeing reality as it really is. The great teacher Osho had an amazing simile to account for why we're in the state we're in. It connects with what Heidegger was talking about. Heidegger says that reason, right, logic, can't understand being, because just as your breath must exist before you can live, right, move, walk, function, you must breathe, so does existence, beingness, precede thought and reason. Reason cannot understand the mysteries of existence. You need more than reason. Reason is instrumental to it, but it can't be on its own. It can become waylaid too easily. Osho says, his metaphor of this is saying, how can you teach a blind man the mystery of light? If a blind man has never seen the sun, or know what light is, even though you can describe it perfectly to him in a million ways, is that the same as the experience of actually experiencing light? Of course it is not. Then we come to another key piece in this journey. I kind of hinted at it earlier. What happens if we have to re-examine all that we've been told about the mind, consciousness, and those divisions that exist? Particularly the one we looked at earlier, that is it true that the ego's defenses exist because it's threatened truly by the id, the ego, the unconscious, given that the unconscious is, after all, part of yourself? What happens if they're wrong there? What happens if, no, that unconscious energy rather wants to embrace, right, the ego, not destroy it? Wow, that's really important. According to the poets, that's what they believe. William Blake, for instance, who referred to the unconscious more as imagination, the imagination is one of the terms he used for it, basically believes that there is nothing negative about the unconscious at all, and that it's only the ego's perceptions of it, right, that make it that way. Remember R.D. Laing, psychophobia, fear of our own minds? The champions of selfhood, Rilke, Nietzsche, Alan Watts, Heidegger, Freud, Rand, whoever, they're asking us to drop that. They're asking us to walk alone, meaning focus on the internal adversary. Theodore Roszak says, the id is that very proto-human psychic core that our evolution has spent millions of years molding to fit the planetary environment. Its seeming unruliness deserves a deeper understanding, if only because it grows from a long evolutionary history. In the course of that history, its dominant characteristics must have been selected for some good reason. In other words, he's saying that part of us, that so-called id that we've repressed and are not directly connected to, is very ancient, very deep. And it's connected to nature. It might even be the same thing. The id, he says, conserves from its long maturing process our treasury of ecological intelligence. Its intractability stems from its deeply ingrained resistance to all social forms that endanger the harmony of the human and the natural. Its untamed selfishness represents a bond between psyche and cosmos, whose distant origins reach back to the initial conditions of the Big Bang. In other words, in the unconscious, in Blake's imagination, is the bond between us and nature. In that room, in that place, is the place of the wedding. It has already taken place, but we've slammed the door on that. He says, just as there is a wisdom of the body which often has a better sense of health than medical science, so too there may be a wisdom of the id that knows what sanity is better than any school of psychiatry whose standard of normality is essentially a defense against misconceived social necessity. Yeah, you don't fit into the system, well, you're broken, and we'll move in to do the fixing. There's a tie-in with time involved in this. Alan Watts talks about it. He says, your entire education has deprived you of this capacity because it was preparing you for the future instead of showing you how to be alive now. In other words, you have been hypnotized by an educational processing system arranged in grades or steps, supposedly leading to some ultimate success. And of course, like we said, we're going to deal with solutions. So then, okay, look, how do we fix this problem? How do we enter back into a personal relationship with that imagination? Wow, it's so complex. Thousands of dollars are paid to psychologists, gurus, and every other kind of person to try and tell us how to do it. Whole movements have arisen. It's very simple. You speak to it. Your relationship with it is no different than your relationship how you cultivate a relationship with a person, the neighbor. As Crowley says, in the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel, the adept is possessed of all he can possibly need. To consult any other is to insult one's angel. Why are you turning to the world? Why are you seeking guidance from the misguided? Why do you seek others to become dependent on you? Why do you become dependent on them? Every time you do that, it's a slap in the face for your higher self. Remember they talked about that a sin unto God will be forgiven, a sin unto the Son of Man will be forgiven, but a sin unto the Holy Spirit can never be forgiven in this life or the next. If you followed my work, you'll know that I identify the self with the Holy Spirit. A sin of yourself. Well then, how can it be forgiven by any external agency? The whole remedy of life is to enter into dialogue with yourself. A conversation. You speak to yourself in the street today, what will happen to you? Don't you know that Beethoven had that dialogue with himself? So did Rilke, so did Rodin, so did Mozart, so did Dali, so did Magritte. Anyone you know as a genius has that perpetual inner dialogue. You wake up, you speak to yourself, you are aware of yourself, and you have that inner dialogue. They're trying to train and drug you out of that today. But this goes very, 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 very deeply indeed. But all I would say is enter into dialogue with it as naturally and as easily as you do with other people. It's no more complex than that. And it's a great honor to yourself to do so. Music is an aspect of this. Leonard Shlain talks about the arts. The ability of species to generate and respond to music is one of the great unexplained mysteries of nature. Apparently, appreciation of music is built into the genetic foundation of all higher life forms. In humans, perfect pitch seems to be encoded somewhere within the strands of DNA. If the fittest do need to survive, then how does the ability to sing in key or keep time to rhythm complement or enhance that survival? The answer is simply, you're not here only to survive. That's why you have that encoding. That's why you have that understanding, because how does the unconscious speak to you? We talked about you entering into dialogue with it in a very natural way. It speaks to you through art and music. Heidegger also mentioned this. The very sound of the unconscious is music. Musical notation, language, even the sound of language, the sound of words is a form of music. Or art. So again, these are ways that people can get involved in it. Pertaining to all of this, of course, is the question of death. What does all we're talking about have for the final termination of life, or for the other forms of death and mortality that we meet every day of the world? And also don't forget the highest anxiety, the highest fear, right, which all forms of tyranny use on you to freeze your brain, and which we also the internal adversary. And the Heideggers and the Schopenhauers and the Kierkegaards tried to turn it around for you and say, well, okay, since you have the fear of death, at least look at it positively to say maybe that'll spur you to feeling lucid about your life. They call it being unto death. By having a consciousness of mortality, right, and temporality, maybe that will do the trick to awaken man to his authentic sense of self. But without even getting into that, we do have this concept of death and questions about it and fear and so on related to this question. And that fear can be manipulated by those who wish to do so. But here's what Schopenhauer said about it, and it's very, very pertinent. He says, consciousness is destroyed in death, to be sure, but that which has been producing it by no means is destroyed. I give the analogy of a match. You strike a match and a flame comes on it, right? And the stick is your life. That match is material. And the light is energy. Slowly the match burns down. The light burns the match away, burns the matter away. And the flame is exhausted, right? Or as the wax or as the match is exhausted, the flame disappears, going back from whence it came. What do? You take another match and strike it. There's the flame again. You take another one, another one, another one. And the light, exactly the same light, comes on every match. In other words, you could fill this entire planet with burned out matches, and you could theoretically fill the entire universe with nothing but burned out struck matches, right? All dead, all expired. And yet you haven't reduced that flame one bit. Same thing with mortality, same thing with the body. You may die, you may pass on your material aspect of yourself and all those ideas, but the energy that brought you and all life into existence, purely with this negentropic power we've been looking at, that's going nowhere. Time to align your mind with that. It's only orientation. You can identify with the matter that is burned up, the broken, burned out match, or the flame that is never reduced even one bit by those exhausted material vessels. But we don't want anything to do with that. We're sick of our humanity. We're sick of our soul. We're sick of our emotions. We're sick of all that dark side stuff and all that sorrow. See, what's the other way? What's all this post-humanism about? You're so sick of yourself, you're so tired of your own thought processes, you're tired of your emotions, that now they're going to lead you right up to this global dystopia by saying, we'll deal with it. You won't even have them anymore, that's the answer. Don't worry about your individual destiny or dharma or any of that. We're heading towards a cybernetic world, a post-human world, constantly pulled outward, which is what science and technology is doing. Come over here, come over here. Your life is only utilitarian. Make the best of it, function in the society, be a good person in the social hive, conform just like the prisoner. Number 6. It's good because the mass says it's good. And don't worry, give us enough time. We'll even prolong life. What kind of life? Oh, I want them to really prolong the prison sentence and the Bastille of lies that they've created for us. Can't wait. Artificiality is another word for it. Gerrymander says it has been only 2 generations since artificial light became so widespread that we moved into artificially lighted environments. Now most of the light we ingest through our skin and eyes is artificial. We are starved for some natural light spectra, and we have overdosed on those spectra that come from artificial light. Incandescent, fluorescent, mercury, vapor, sodium, television, and others. Indeed, about 90% of the total emission of an incandescent lamp lies in the infrared. But as we said, scientists are now working overtime to make sure that we don't ever have to look at any of these darker emotions, which, as we said, are the stages along the road of selfhood, right? Yeah. Now we can turn off the brain's morality centers. We can make psychopaths of you all like we are psychopathic. As Aldous Huxley said, never before have we been in a position to make so many fools, maniacs, and criminals of so many people. But this is also very much a collective movement. And if we look to the scientists, do we find any answers? Eric Fromm says the reasons why social scientists have not considered the question of the optimal social conditions for man's growth a matter of primary concern can easily be discerned if one recognizes the sad fact that, with a few outstanding exceptions, social scientists are essentially apologists for and not critics of the existing social system. Mathematicians try to negate the validity of supernatural experiences and phenomena, I write. They say that many apparently supernatural experiences are simply coincidences mistaken for something unique. They cite experiences had by many people and say they're illegitimate. Remember, idiothetic, nomothetic, ideographic. You have it, it's your experience, but you can't reproduce it. Oh, well, it didn't happen, it's inauthentic. However, no scientist can altogether, this is the argument you can use against them, however, no scientist can altogether eliminate the possibility of a truly numinous experience from occurring. Just because something is unlikely or scientifically unverifiable does not mean that it did not occur. Moreover, scientists merely interpret interpretations. That is, they do not measure or quantify the actual experience. They nomothetically measure and quantify the consequences, afterthoughts, and opinions of the experiencer. They compare and contrast an experience with others of a similar kind. However, all experiences of a numinous nature, right, are subjectively interpreted, meaning all those deep inner ideographic experiences are subjectively interpreted. So no true or wholly relevant objective statement can be made on them, right? There is only subjective truth. Everything else is interpretation. The believer in supernatural phenomena can't altogether convince a scientist of the validity of the experience they've had. They can only relate what it meant to them personally. Party B was not present during the experience and can't know what it was like. Now, one has an idea of their own being or selfhood. One person's idea is not identical as another's about even that idea of self. If it were, you wouldn't have a self. The very word implies separation, differentiation. The self is distinct, unique, and utterly private. Any attempt to violate the self's autonomy via communication or relationship weakens the self and the experiences had by the self. Sharing has no validity to the self. There is no relationship between the self and the world of other people. Thomas Godwin, the father of Mary Shelley, said that in one sense, everything that goes by the name of cooperation is in a sense evil. And I think he was talking about this. Never forget when you read passages like this, though, that what I'm really talking about is try to discover all those forces that prevent you from coming to the self, both scientific and theological and social. The opposite, of course, of what we're talking about here is the consensus that is now becoming ubiquitous, which is what people want. They want to turn off all of that stuff in their heads. We send our children there, we indoctrinate them into saying, what makes you the same as everybody else? And that's not wrong to do that, but to the extent where the selfhood is erased, and the ubiquitous collectivity, basically nothing is... that. You know what, that's right, the global village is rising on the death of a man's individuality, his own sense of self. Is that a good thing? You know what's going to happen? The more that this takes place, the very individual will become totally expendable. A very important point, which I guess we can't have time to go into, is the whole idea of the subject-objective thing, where the psychologist Jung has even discovered that, look, your unconscious content, this is an aspect of yourself, is regarded as separate and objective. In psychological terms, it's one of the arguments psychologists use against scientists, by the way, but they say that internally, a man's own inner thought processes, his content of his own unconscious, is as considered as external as a table or chair or tree or anything outside. What a predicament. We want to come up to look at a bit of something to do with relationships, so how this dynamic works more in our private lives, you see. But first we have a few points from Fromm on false love. As I've said in other works, it's not in fact anger, violence, hatred that has caused any of the world's problems. Not really. It's false love. People need to really give that some major thought. It's that which is posing as the real authentic thing that causes the problems. And Fromm talks about this. He says, the more love I turn toward the outside world and less love I have for myself, and vice versa. Freud is thus moved to describe the phenomena of falling in love as an impoverishment of one's self-love, because all love is turned to an object outside oneself. Right? And Fromm says, there is no word in our language which is being so much misused and prostituted as the word love. It is being preached by those who were ready to condone every cruelty if it served their purposes. It has been used as a disguise under which to force people into sacrificing their own happiness, into submitting their whole self to those who profited from this surrender. You know, what's done under the name of love is so corrupt. Fromm says the majority of well-adapted individuals have lost their own self at an early age and replaced it completely by a social self offered to them by society. They have no neurotic conflicts because they themselves, and therefore the discrepancy between themselves and the outside world, have disappeared. The immersion in the pseudo-self. Now, two phenomena closely connected with each other are frequently presented as love, the masochistic and sadistic love. In the case of masochistic love, one gives up oneself, one's initiative and integrity in order to become submerged entirely in the other person who is felt to be stronger. Because of deep anxieties which give rise to the feelings that one cannot stand on one's own feet, one wants to be rid of one's own individual self and to become part of another human being, thus becoming secure and finding a center which one misses in oneself. And there are many people who are experts in making us dependent, who want us to feel guilty. Now, the surrender of one's own self has often been praised as an example of the greatest love. It is actually a form of idolatry, and also an annihilation of the self. The sadistic love, on the other hand, springs from the desire to swallow its subject, to make him a will-less instrument in one's own hands. This drive is also rooted in a deep anxiety and an ability to stand alone. But instead of finding increased strength by being swallowed, strength and security are found in having a limited power over the other person. The masochistic as well as sadistic kind of love are expression of one basic need, which springs from a basic inability to be independent. Now, many married couples stay together for this reason. The marriage gives them the opportunity to experience hate, quarrels, sadism, and sublimation. They stay together not in spite of their fights, but because of them. Masochistic behavior and pleasure in suffering or submitting has one of its roots in this need for excitement. Masochistic persons suffer from the difficulty of being able to initiate excitation and of reacting readily to normal stimuli. But they can react when the stimulus overpowers them, as it were, when they can given up themselves to the excitement forced upon them. Let's see. No, religion. Slaves, submit yourself to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if a man bears up under pain of unjust suffering, because he is conscious of God. But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. Look at this. The Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, and Romans had no word in their language for sin. The Israelites introduced both the word and the concept into the stream of Western civilization, and by so doing diverted it. I've had this quote so many times. We look at it one more time in this context. So we have a clear definition of psychopathy and tyranny. Nothing, says Martin Luther, is more poisonous, harmful, or devilish than a man in rebellion. Yeah, to them. The ones who are bending over backwards to rape you of every kind of selfhood that you could imagine. Or immerse you in the collective, make it so seductive with their talismanic words. It's not that sports and enjoyments are wrong, it's just what is it predicated upon. Or again, since they know that a lot of people want to break away from that, they're not happy with that, you create the gimmick merchants who will take you a little bit further, you see, who will promise you all sorts of escapes from that mediocrity. But we have to question whether or not that's really ultimately authentic. Are they really helping us to find ourselves, or are they just creating a new set of allegiances? Or there's a total dropout, just like, I can't handle this anymore, and flop. The person just gives in to the mass, the Dionysian mass, as we've been studying. There's a whole net of deceivers waiting there to entrap. As Krishnamurti said, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And we'll finish off by reciting his amazing words that really help to encapsulate what we've been talking about here today. He said that truth is a pathless land, and you cannot approach it by any path whatsoever, by any religion, by any sect. Truth, being limitless, unconditioned, unapproachable by any path whatsoever, cannot be organized. Nor should any organization be formed to lead or to coerce people along any particular path. My only concern is to set humanity absolutely, unconditionally free. Man cannot come to it through any organization, through any creed, through any dogma, priest, or ritual, not through any philosophical knowledge or psychological technique. He has to find it through the understanding of the contents of his own mind, through observation, and not through intellectual analyses or introspective dissection. And Jung reminds us of the conflict and the difficulty. The shadow, he says, is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. For no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. See, the shadow stands between you and yourself. It stands in the way of the soul. But shadow implies a shadow. Shadow, he means shadow literally. What is a shadow? To have a shadow, you must have something that's casting it. The shadow is not the shadow of your ego, because as we said, the ego is a social ego. So the shadow is really the shadow cast by your social persona, that collective mishmash hive that you've embodied. It's actually one of the least personal things about you, is what the shadow is. The shadow is everybody's shadow. And if you do not bring all the knights and the elements and the archetypes and the agencies together. Shamanic teaching spoke about the round table, the coming together, no head, no masculine authority, no hierarchy. All the original shamanic models were based on the sphere, the hologram, the circle. But until you have brought all the voices, all the knights from all their travels to the table, how are you going to resolve the problems and the questions? They all have to be facing the same direction. All the aspects of yourself, nothing banished, nothing repressed. Because you will not fight tyranny with force, only with wisdom, and most importantly, psychic immunity. Eric Fromm talks about the outsider by saying, in fact, it is the fully sane person who feels isolated in the insane society. And he may suffer so much for the incapacity to communicate that it is he who becomes psychotic. As we've said, the person who's trying to handle this becomes the outsider. And if he's not immune, he will be destroyed. The net that catches everybody right now, because this is happening all across the world, this is where the big leviathans come in. To try and hope that you won't do it, that you'll take the easy way out. Take a pill, it's simple, right? But you've just shot your soul to death. Why do all that inner work? And I'll say what I said at the beginning. What you have to understand is that when these dark aspects start to come and visit, we don't welcome them in. We imagine that we're suddenly being haunted and destroyed. The depressions that people feel, the anxieties, is actually, when you really see it correctly, is the first time they've even negotiated that inner voice, but they've learned to think of that as the enemy, as opposed to the voices of the world. Here we now have it. Scientists may soon be able to erase fear and trauma from your mind. That is the death of humanity. That is 2012. That is post-humanism. That's where we're going. All the other aspects of it are kind of less important than this. As David Hawkins reminds us, there is no antidepressant that will cure depression that's spiritually based. For the malaise does not originate from brain dysfunction, but from an accurate response to the desecration of life. Now here's the final point. Jung brought up this most incredible point about the dynamics of the unconscious mind, and basically it goes for all kinds of mysteries. He says, we know that the mask of the unconscious is not rigid. It reflects the face we turn toward it. Hostility lends it a threatening aspect. Friendliness softens its features. It only becomes dangerous when our conscious attitude to it is hopelessly wrong. To the degree that we repress it, its danger increases. In other words, to the unconscious, like to any mystery, even to people, whatever attitude, because attitude is so important, that you project into it, is what it becomes. So if you turn a face of hostility and false curiosity and power hungriness or fear or anxiety towards the unconscious, you'll be met with demons. In the unconscious, there is no road except your steps as you make it. Like Krishnamurti is saying, it's a pathless land. You enter into it at your own will with no companions. And you meet there whatever is in your psyche. Whatever you bring to it is what it reflects. And this is partly the reason why a lot of people won't do this, because there's very toxic people who can never do this. And then it's also the reason which stops us from going forward. Our ideas shape our reality. Then if we know that, we have to be very, very cautious about what we're doing. Blake said it this way, in your own bosom you bear your heaven and earth, and all you behold. Though it appears without, it is within, in your imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow. Remember the Maya, the ideas that we have about that? And Rand says that men have been taught that it is a virtue to agree with others, but the Creator is the man who disagrees. Men have been taught that it is a virtue to swim with the current, but the Creator is the man who goes against the current. Men have been taught that it is a virtue to stand together, but the Creator is the man who stands alone. Shwala Delubich strikes at the heart of all these scientific paradigms. He says man is not a beast, he is animated. Man is the epitome of the cosmos, a creature housing the divine spark. Man is not an evolved amphibian or animal form that has become what we are. Man is perfect at his origin, a divine being who has degenerated into what we are. Look at that. Man is not an evolved amphibian, an animal form that became what we are. Right? Hasn't we been taught that from the childhood? Man is perfect at his origin, a divine being who has degenerated into what we are. He's talking about devolution. The scientists are always trying to put earrings on the Mona Lisa, fix what isn't broken. What is the attitude that we show to the unconscious? Heidegger already told you what it is. That your thinking through consciousness is actually an act of thanks. It's actually an act of daily gratitude, not in some forced New Age spinner rack way. A complete understanding of the miracle of your existence here and now, and that thing out there that you see every morning, the sunrise, the clouds, the stars, that whole natural matrix out there is you, by the way. It's not separate from you. That's a delusion. That's your Maya. That is you. Treat it as such. If you treat it toxically, that's because you have a toxic attitude towards yourself. If you treat it with reverence, it's because you have a reverent attitude towards yourself. But it's all rooted in your own vision and understanding of yourself. And we'll finish on this. The beautiful words of Chuang Tzu from the 4th century BC, who literally teaches us, lets us know what leads towards the true liberation and wisdom. He says, "He who can free himself from achievement and from fame, descend and be lost amid the masses of men, he will flow like the Tao. Unseen he will go about like life itself, with no name and no home. Simple he is, without distinction. To all appearances, he is a fool. His steps leave no trace. He has no power. He achieves nothing, has no reputation. Since he judges no one judges him. Such is the perfect man. His boat is empty." Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time these last 3 months. It's been a great pleasure. I've enjoyed it. And stay in touch with us, by email and other things, and the postings of the talk online. Share it with your friends. Contact me for resources. And let's just go out and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks a lot. Never forget, the dictator is always right. Theodore Roszak, in Voice of the Earth, says that modern psychiatry has never undertaken a symbolic reading of the city. Doubtless this is because psychiatrists work from within the city, on which they are totally dependent for their sustenance, for recognition from their peers, for making money, and for building their careers. He goes on to say, "For an eco-psychology, nothing serves as a more telling symptom of our collective state of soul than this urban habitat, which has balanced on the edge of psychopathology since its beginning. The industrial city might be seen as the collective body armor of our culture, a pathological effort to distance us from close contact with the natural continuum from which we evolve." Another important word to know about is simulacra, from the work of the philosopher Jean Baudrillard. Jerry Mander, speaking on the subject, says that our environment itself is the manifestation of the mental processes of other humans, of all species of the planet, and all the cultures of the human species. We 20th century Americans have become the first in history to live predominantly inside projections of our own minds. But what happens if our own minds are artificial? Our thought is artificial. Then what? What becomes of our society, our environment? He goes on to say the role of the media in all this is to confirm the validity of the arbitrary world in which we live. The role of television is to project that world via images into our heads, all of us at the same time. Collectivism again. But the top-level psychologists and sociologists know all about it. In the very important book by Erich Fromm, Escape from Freedom, he says the fact that millions of people share the same vices does not make them virtuous. The fact that they share so many errors does not make the errors to be truths. And the fact that millions of people share the same forms of mental pathology does not make them sane. Speaking of Heidegger's Das Man, the non-self, the inauthentic self, J.A.C. Brown, in his book Techniques of Persuasion, says that because some neurosis makes people incompetent at work, we're liable to assume that those without a neuroses would be competent, whereas the truth is that it is only the incompetent neurotic who is seen by the psychiatrists. And since neurosis is socially defined, we ignore the great bulk of brilliant people who are successful precisely because they are neurotic. In other words, being neurotic in a neurotic society can actually bring you some benefits. It's being sane that can cause the problems. On the same point of dialogue with the higher self, Crowley says the single supreme ritual is the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. It is the raising of the complete mass in a vertical straight line. Any deviation, he says, from this line tends to become black magic. Any other operation is black magic. So in other words, anything in this world that hasn't involved the higher self constitutes black magic. Well, doesn't that include most of what's going on today in religion and science? He also says that magic is the science of understanding oneself and one's condition. It is the art of applying that understanding in action. The Crowleyan point of view is perfectly illustrated by David Cherubim of the Order of the Thelemic Golden Dawn, who writes that mystical alchemy is a personal science, a sublime and effective system of self-initiation. Only you, as a single individual, can calculate and follow your own way up the great mountain of hermetic attainment. All essential guidance is within you, in the innermost center of your heart, where your own holy guardian angel or inner self resides. To depend on any other thing than your own holy guardian angel to accomplish the great work is to insult your angel, who is within you to instruct and guide you. All essential wisdom by which to achieve the great work is to be ascertained only within you. Nowhere else will you find the truth.